这个有的时候啊，我们在看西方的媒体的时候啊，就会觉得，哎，对于中国的经济啊，似乎有一点过于浮于表面化。那我昨天还跟何斌先生交流说，现在呀最开心的事情啊，每天就是突然看到让你耳目一新的文章，或者是听到一些让你觉得思路与众不同的分析。那么今天呢，我们要为大家介绍的就是这样一个播客节目，而播客节目的这一位主讲人或者是嘉宾呢，就是我们非常熟悉的 Gavocall 的创始人，他呢是一个法国人，名字叫做盖夫。那我们知道啊 ，Gavocall 啊不但是有很多关于中国经济的非常精编实弊的这样的一种分析和报道，很多准确的数据的阐述。同时啊 ，Gavocall 的研究师中有一批是我们非常尊敬的，比如之前我们多次为大家介绍的关注中国科技和产业问题的 Dan Wang 等等等等。那么作为这样一家科技经济中国咨询公司的老板的盖夫，他到底是一个怎样的人呢？在我们今天在节目末尾为大家完整展示的这一段播客节目中盖夫首先介绍了自己的人生经历。他是一个法国人，之前呢还在法国参军，但是实在发现这个军队真的是非常的无聊。那么他当时呢，没什么事的时候就学了中文，在这个美国念了杜克大学，同时也有很好的金融知识。他当时就像很多从军队出来因为军队的生活是非常清苦的，也没有什么津贴，想找一份挣钱的工作，于是就去了巴黎的法国兴业银行。他当时正好赶上了一个好机会，就是法国兴业银行是收购了一家泛亚的经纪商，交易是在什么时候完成的呢？1997年。于是作为法国兴业银行当时为数不多会说中文的一个年轻人，盖夫就被派到去亚洲了。但是我们一听1997年，哎呀，亚洲当时的情况可并不好。的确，交易完成不到1个月，盖夫到亚洲我们叫做还没站稳脚，结果就出现了亚洲金融危机。当时有这个6周的时间，盖夫就说每天都在看到身边的这一些国家，每一个国家就像大出血一样，整个经济一败涂地当时的印尼盾每天币值的下跌10%到15%结果最后几周之内，印尼盾的币值损失了92%，现在想起来感觉就像梦一场那么盖夫后来回忆说，绝对是一场大屠杀，当时所有公司的股本都被一扫而空。但是他说反过来对于我这样一个职业生涯刚开始的年轻人来说可能是一种幸运。为什么呀？因为我没有太多的责任，大家都这么惨，所以我搞砸了，大家也不知道我搞砸了，因为大家都认为这不是你的错，这是整个市场的问题。那么因此他说在职业生涯的第一笔交易中就感受到了亚洲金融危机，事情发展的如此之快，让他在一个非常短暂的机遇内就出现了这样的一个迅速成熟的过程，也迅速加深了他对于亚洲的理解和对于世界金融危机的理解，而这个地方未来呢就成为了他工作和研究的重点。当时有很多的公司一提到亚洲就像听到瘟神的名字一样，迅速的撤离退缩是降低成本，然后很快的从亚洲移出去。但是当时盖夫有一位他的这个同事或者叫做导师，就提出了一个有趣的观点，说咱们别着急。为什么呢？因为当时正好是中国准备加入世贸组织2001年、2001年的时候，他当时的这一位人生导师就说中国正在做的是一件非常大的事。很快你就会看到这一些逃跑亚洲的外国公司都会到中国那里去投资设厂，然后中国就会进入一个高速发展的阶段。当时盖夫的这一个商业伙伴叫做科列斯基，他说中国这个机会是我们不能错过的，现在没有人关注它，但是我们可以关注中国，我们不仅要关注中国，在所有这些投资银行和海外资本都害怕亚洲的时候，我们可以作为向西方人解释中国的人。而后盖夫就在香港成立了他的公司。在2001年，当时正好是亚洲金融危机之后对于这样一个刚刚建立自己公司的创业者来说，也是不幸中的万幸。为什么呢？因为当时香港非常的便宜，整个亚洲都非常的便宜。当时呢，香港为了吸引西方资本重新回炉，监管也非常的宽松，因此他创业起来也非常的容易。说到创业这个问题盖夫在这个播客节目采访中还特别提到了一个人叫比尔盖茨。这个何斌先生不知道你知不知道，比尔盖茨当年在哈佛读书的时候，他的同室友 来是一个数学系的学生，结果他的这个数学室友数学比比尔盖茨强的太多了。比尔盖茨本来是要学数学的，结果被他的室友给吓坏了干脆放弃了数学，转向了计算机。他的这个室友叫布莱德曼。布莱德曼后来去做了什么样的工作呢？就像当时很多美国最聪明的年轻人一样，去美国的华尔街做了一位税务律师。所以当时比比尔盖茨还天才的这样一个年轻人，就选择把自己的青春消耗在了华尔街的税法上的。盖夫讲到这里就讲到了美国以及他的母国法国。他说如果说这个税法是美国最荒谬的，那么劳动法就是法国最荒谬的，你根本不可能解雇任何人。美国的税法它还有17000页，法国的劳动法有3万页，等等等等。所以今天我们也特别向观众朋友们提醒，有的时候我们叫做聪明人找到对于自己短期回报最高的工作，但是对于整个社会资源的分配，让这一些聪明人都去华尔街上去做税务律师，真的是对于他们智商和智慧最好的利用吗？这个问题我们还要思考盖夫接下来就讲到了一个问题，讲到了中国。他说今天如果我要是打开西方媒体，每个人都告诉我中国就崩溃了，但是你仔细看中国的数字，这是一个正在崩溃前的国家的情况吗？中国现在每月的贸易顺差是800亿美元，如果是按照1年来计算的话，1年有1万多亿的贸易顺差。那你有这样的贸易顺差，你就得制成1万多亿的产品出口，才会有这样的顺差。那我们看到中国在太空、在半导体、在喷气发动机在电动汽车、在太阳能板，所有这些领域不仅仅是正在迅速的有制程能力上的赶超，甚至是超过了西方国家。你再看到中国现在的教育水平，60%的大学毕业率其实已经非常接近美国了。90年代初，当时盖夫在中国学习的时候中国每年大概是30万大学生毕业，不到1代人的时间里，这个数字是翻了30倍，这个在其他的国家是没有办法想象的。现在我们一提每年1000多万大学生毕业。其实这1000多万大学生，大家不要想光是这个大学生其中从事 STEM 也就是理工科毕业的这样的一些专业的学生是美国的2倍而言。什么意思？也就是这样一些理工科的人力资本是像潮水一样的涌入中国的就业市场。因此他就讲到了一点，就是说大家在谈到中国经济出现的各种各样的问题的时候，第一，大家要看到这一些问题的真实性；第二，也要看到中国另外一种潜力，或者是经常被这些新闻媒体头条所忽视的巨大的制程能力、创造力，以及整个教育生态系统。贺明先生，有关于盖夫先生之前谈到的有关于中国经济的这样的观点是不是符合你对于中国经济的判断？
是的，不是简单的一个判断的结论，而是简单的一个思维方式的一个判断。现在的中国的这个经济有一个很恶劣的状况，但是这个恶劣是双方面的一方面的恶劣的是中国政府不准经济学家，不准大家创设中国的经济，这个有一点太荒谬了，这缺乏一个最起码的文明社会，或者是我们不要说文明社会，我们就讲一个基础性的一个讨论。尤其像经济这样的一个问题是个技术性的问题，同时又有关到国计民生，你只能唱好不能唱衰。但是你经济既有周期力或者没有周期力，它也有跌和涨的这个时候。所以中国政府这样一种做法极大的强化了另外的声音，就是不信任中国政府的行为。但是另一方面呢，中国的一批良知或者是一批勇敢的人，他们去批评中国政府的经济政策和政治政策，这个他们的出发点来讲，或者是发出这种声音来讲，是对中国政府的一种补正，是一种纠正。但是问题是，这些讨论很多人呢也是这种的结果是强化了大家对中国的缺乏希望。强化了大家一种悲观或者是怨恨的情绪。如果你是在一个丰富的讨论市场，这个没什么了不起的。像美国，你华尔街股票最好的时候，也有人说很快完蛋了；华尔街股票一塌糊涂的时候，还有人说你还挺好，对吧？但是中国就出现了两极，这个两极呢，就是说一方面只准唱好不准唱衰一方面呢只唱衰不唱好。 即使呢唱好或者唱衰，这都是无所谓的，但是需要的是一种专业的声音，需要的是一个真正冷静的一个专业的声音。但是中国有一些人很好的招牌，很好的名望但是呢，他们实际上只是充满一种怨恨，因为他们发现这种怨恨表现他的勇气，而怨恨呢，让能够得到这个民众的欢呼，因为觉得你有勇气，你很厉害。对吧？然后呢，就采取这种方式去扭曲对中国经济的这个理解、鼓吹这是一个非常大的一个问题。这样一位学者，这样一位观察者，他完全不同。
那我们再说他对中国经济的观察。现在我们说中国经济是不是可能会出现危机？那么如果是严肃的经济学者，可能说中国的这个危机外溢性是非常小的。但是呢，房地产萧条的确可能导致中国经济的内爆。但是在盖夫看来，中国经济连内爆的可能性也没有。这是他怎么分析得出的一个结论呢？首先，他又强调了一个问题，说这个房地产萧条引发的经济问题，实际上并不是中国所独有的。在历史上，其实几乎每一个发达国家都经历过这样一个房地产的兴衰循环所导致的经济问题。
不要说发展中国家，我是在加拿大、美国，对。
接下来就讲房地产萧条导致银行系统出问题，导致失业率上升，经济出现某一种通缩的现象。90年代初是日本，92年是瑞典，94年是加拿大97年是东南亚，08年是美国，然后2011年、2012年是欧洲。那所以我们就说这个房地产市场由于它本身就具有非常大的投机性和泡沫性，也有很多的居民财富在里面，它本身就具有这样的一种脆弱性。因此从这个角度来理解中国整个房地产的问题，它是世界问题的一部分，是整个房地产产业脆弱性的一部分。你很难说中国的这个房地产问题就是中国现在只有中国面临的一个问题，这个定性是不准确的。但是我们说中国这个房价20年来是最昂贵的一处，现在是这个降价都没人买的这样的一个东西，是不是因为我们说中国的体量太大，所以这个房地产的危机在中国就特别严重呢？当然有这样的原因，但是这个盖夫就提出了一个观点，说咱们还得做一下负担能力比例这样的一笔账。那我们看到房地产价格过去几年里大概是下降了20%到30%，但是在过去5年里，中国人的收入也增加了20%到30%。过去整个房地产的价值被人认为是过高的，结果现在一下负担能力比例就好多了。那么你从这个角度来看的确中国可能出现了经济放缓，扼杀了这样的一种经济增长，但是反过来说，中国的这个房价在过去几年里也的确是消除了房价高不可攀、不可持续的这样的一个问题。中国经济那种原始的野兽式的那一种感觉现在是没有了。但是你真的说中国经济内爆了吗？房地产行业要经过修正，但是我们看到中国没有失业大军涌入城市去找工作，没有出现街头严重的社会治安危机那么这个就是说，整个的这个中国的社会情况仍然是相对比较稳定的。那么到底为什么中国化解这一次房地产危机，在盖夫来看不存在内爆的可能性呢？我们谈到房地产危机的时候，会谈到另外一个问题，就是地方政府的债务。这是现在经济学家最担忧的一点。盖夫说地方政府的债务，您表面上来看2万亿左右，的确是一个大到不能再大的一个数字，但是你也得算一笔账。首先，中国的银行基本上是由国家控制的，监管机构完全有能力出动银行的力量，在5、6年间比较和缓地解决债务问题。2万亿你觉得是一笔大钱，但其实这只是中国未偿银行贷款的6%。那监管机构到底怎样处理这样的一些不良贷款问题呢？中国其实以往也不是没有面临过这样的问题，比如说90年代国有资产整合08年和07年当时出现了制造业的债务，也是这样。这个过去中国的这个地方政府是有一个什么样的一个模式呢？我们叫做天高皇帝远先这个房地产商是拿一笔钱呢，先不盖房，先在城里面最豪华的地方买一个卖房办公室然后呢人们来这儿买房，把定金给房地产开发商，再利用定金的杠杆作用借钱盖楼等等等等。现在很多的房地产开发商倒闭了，没有人愿意给房地产开发商付定金了，所以过去这种模式就行不通了。那我们知道，在美国，在2008年是银行出现了挤兑，大家不愿意把钱 借给银行了。在中国啊，是房地产开发商出现了挤兑，没有人把钱愿意把定金交到房地产开发商这里了。但是房地产开发商对于整个金融系统的这个影响力和传播力和整个银行系统是不一样的。中国的银行系统是稳健的，因此整个房地产的问题就可以是局限在房地产问题里面，或者是局限在房地产上下游产业里面，它很难通过银行系统传导到整个经济面上。那我们说政府到底怎么介入？在这个盖夫看来，其实非常简单，就像美国为房地产开发商设立一个类似于联邦存款保险公司这样的一个机构一样啊，这样类似的机构其实30年代美国就有了。什么意思呢？就是政府为开发商提供担保，但是呢，开发商向保险公司付款。中国政府是知道这一点的，中国政府明明是可以这么做的，但是中国政府却没有这么做，这只能说明一点，就是政府心里知道。这是他们想要的结果，就是他就希望房地产价值出现这样的一个修正。
对，这句话讲到最关键的地方。
接着往下讲，那为什么中国政府就是认为房地产开发活动对于中国经济不利，就应该让这个行业渐渐的疲软掉呢？认为不能够发展国家的技术和工业能力。另外，他讲到了一点我们之前没有提到的，就是房地产开发商和地方政府的勾结，反而是对于中央的权威形成了威胁。那我们知道啊，天高皇帝远，过去大量的地方腐败其实就是通过房地产来进行的。在中国啊，最容易发财的办法是什么呢？就是说你跟你的市长啊送点钱，送点什么的，说服你的这个市长或者是你地方的这个领导啊，把一些农业用地啊、工业用地啊变成私人房地产开发商的用地，然后呢卖给你送钱的这些房地产开发商的朋友。结果呢，他就讲到说，2008年当时4万亿去刺激经济，很多都是流入这些房地产开发商的腰包了。那个时候啊，很多什么市长啊、书记啊、地方那种不知名的小城市，大家啊全是二代。开着法拉利在车上到处转悠，就是中国法拉利鼎盛的时期，正好是那4万亿出台的时期。4万亿到了房地产开发商手里，房地产开发商拿到了钱之后，收回扣给了这个市长和书记，市长书记直接塞给了自己的儿子和女儿，于是便捷就是法拉利了。从房地产讲到法拉利，这是他一个非常有趣的观察角度。他就讲到说大家在看到中国这个政权的时候也有它的两面性。首先，它不是一个民主政权，它不是天堂。但是现在我们在这个西方媒体中往往看到把中国政权按照朝鲜式的解释方式去理解，它是一个独裁政权，但它不是一个完全迟钝的独裁政权。它是有腐败问题，它是有各种各样的经济问题，是有各种各样的不公平的问题。但是实际上，根据盖夫的了解，中国领导层实际上是花了很多的时间来了解人们的诉求是什么。另外他们反而是非常快的、非常高效的要解决老百姓民怨的焦点，因为害怕某一个地方的怨气可能会扩张，形成一个更大的不稳定的来源。因此他判断说中国是一个独裁政权，但它不是一个反应迟钝的独裁政权，它恰恰是一个反应过敏的一个独裁政权就是这样的一个我们叫做这个非常敏感的这样的一个政权，哪里他听到了有一点可能民怨的影子，马上就解决这个问题，反而可能让很多的经济问题在中国在演变成政治问题之前能够得到最快的解决。房地产萧条对于中国来说当然是很难熬的一件事情，但是在盖夫来看这呢其实和外界对于这个问题的想象有很大的不同。何明先生，今天我们时间有限，但是请你简单点评，然后我们就进入下一环节。
我觉得这一次的经济的存在的问题是给中国人带来了沮丧、愤怒、失望，或者是怎么样，但是其实也是给过去30年的固有的经济的一个清醒的时间。这段清醒的时间，大家想一想，过去这些地方我们为什么积累了这么多财富，我们为什么会发展的这么好，为什么现在出这些问题？我们经常批评中国的政府的政策的粗暴，这种批评当然中国政府的官员来讲，他说你知道什么情况我们不粗暴的话，以聪明的老百姓，你给了点空间在美国或者在法国，你搞一个什么政策，大家傻乎乎就执行了。但是在中国，有无数的聪明人把你这个柔性的政策给毁掉，所以我们只能粗暴因为我批评过他们粗暴那么呢，但是呢，他说粗暴这个东西不是永久的，但是粗暴这个东西一定要是把那个固热的认为房地产人越涨，这样的话才是一个真正的危险。所以我们讲房地产是一个主动的把它击泡的一个泡沫，而且从处理的基地来讲，我不能说中央来一个政策又把它救回来了，不会的。 正常的情况，在加拿大，你刚才讲的加拿大，那都是我非常熟悉和感受的那种危机啊。在美国我也经受了一种危机啊，房地产我是讲。那么通过这些危机，你就会感受出来，大家都是危机，世界末日到了，然后就开始采取一些措施来应对这些危机，然后慢慢10年左右，年化也涨回来了。所以房地产慢慢给人的感觉就是10年就是一条好汉。
基本上房地产整个出现的松动带动经济危机，每一个经济危机恢复的周期也
对，而且有一个你们经济学里面有一个很幼稚的玩笑嘛，就是说哪一个城市建摩天大楼全世界再高，这个城市是会完蛋，就是说它基本上是一个不可预期的泡沫，但是这个泡沫一定会发生。
泡沫由此开始，泡沫也从房价这儿倒塌。
对，
美国是不是商业地产的泡沫明年就要塌了？咱们今天不能乌鸦嘴啊。好，咱们时间到了，接下来的这个环节啊，我们要谈中国的汽车，日本去哪里了？欧洲去哪里了？以及美国现在到底可能面临美元的什么样的寸钝？好，
谢谢。
You know, in the past 25 years, I've lived in Hong Kong, so the whole gun culture has sort of passed me by a little bit.
Right. So let's jump ahead and talk about your founding Gavical, and the opportunity maybe was you thought there was a lot of opportunity in emerging markets. It wasn't covered sufficiently. Maybe tell that story a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So I was working at Paribas, so I started at Paribas in Paris, and I was very lucky because they, sort of typical French bank fashion, they bought a Pan-Asian broker. It took them 18 months to close the deal, and the deal closed on June 1st, 1997. So I was sent over with my boss to do the integration. My boss was the head of research for France, and he became head of research for Asia, and he was sent over to do the integration. So I go with him, because he's like, oh, you speak English, you speak Chinese, come over with me. And I was gagging to go, of course. Then I saw you laugh, but maybe some of your auditors won't know that July 1st, so a month after the transaction closed, July 1st, 1997, is when the Thai baht devalues, which kicks off the Asian crisis. And the Asian crisis, if you didn't live through it, was really quite something. I remember calling my dad as it was unfolding. We had like 6 weeks where the Indonesian rupiah was falling 10 to 15% every day. Now, this is a currency, not a stock. The stock market was also falling 15% a day. A lot of the stocks were opening, limit down, close, and then start again the next day, limit down, close. Because there were sort of limits you could hit, 10 or 15% typically. And if you fell that much, the stock was closed for the day, and then you'd start again the next day. And anyway, so the currency itself was down 10 to 15% a day. I think, I'm quoting from memory, I think the Indonesian rupiah ended up going down 92% over the period. Well, it was from 2,300 to 19,000, whatever that makes. You're the physicist, you can probably calculate it in your head. But the Thai baht ended up going down falling 2/3, the Malaysian ringgit, the Korean won. It was an absolute bloodbath. And the equity in a lot of these companies were completely wiped out because most people had debt in US dollars. So anyway, Asia's this bloodbath, which, when you're starting off your career, is actually a blessing. Because first, you don't have too many responsibilities. So, as your business is bleeding everywhere, that's not your fault. And you didn't make any bad decisions. You just got here. And so that was number one. Number two, it's a blessing because you realize how quickly things can unravel. And so for me, it was a great formative experience. But long story short, as Asia imploded, most investment banks shut down, decided, all right, this place is a disaster zone. Let's cut our costs, back out, and leave. And so the research budgets of every major firm by 2000, 2001 were basically down to nothing. And this is just when then China entered the WTO. Now, remember, at that point, China is a nobody. Nobody really cares. But if you're living there, and you're seeing what's happening, it's pretty obvious this is going to be a really big deal. They're making the right investments. They're investing in their infrastructure. You can see all the foreign companies opening plants there. Then you know that with the WTO, it's going to go into hyperdrive. So the road seemed well traced, and yet nobody was there really talking about it. So my father, Anatol, my business partner, Anatol Koletsky, myself thought, okay, this is, there's a niche here in the market, in essence. China's going to be really important. Nobody's looking at it. We can be the guys who explain China to Westerners, in essence, since the investment banks don't even seem interested in doing it anymore. And we got lucky because, it was the right wave to surf. For roughly 10, 12 years, China did become the really, really big thing in the global economy. Now, it isn't the case anymore for a number of reasons. And there's other exciting stories out there. But it was a case of, right place, right time. And so, we set up in Hong Kong. And, back in 2001, post-Asian crisis, Hong Kong was a super cheap place to operate from. Very light regulatory touch, very easy to start a business, very easy to run a business. It just worked out.
Would you still say that now? So even after the handover, is it still an easy place to run a business?
Well, I would say that everywhere in the world today is harder to run a business than 20 years ago. Almost. In terms of regulations, if you're in London, if you're in New York, if you're in Paris, everybody complains that today is harder than 20 years ago. And in that respect, the same is true of Hong Kong. But Hong Kong is still easier than New York, London, Paris, etc. And it's easier on many fronts. First, it's easier on taxation. Hong Kong still has, for me, the best system where you fill out your taxes on a postcard. It's, how much did you earn? A couple deductions for charity, etc., and medical expenses and education expenses. Taxable income, send us 16%. Boom. I mean, it literally fits on a postcard. And same income tax rate for corporates as for individuals. So there's no reason to try to do things here or do things there. It very simple. So that part has not changed. Hong Kong is still, it's not a tax haven, but it's literally a tax paradise because it makes things easy to run.
Yep.
When you compare it to the U.S., where there's deductions for this, deductions for that, and it's so complicated in the U.S. that you need like a guy who's taken a PhD to do your taxes.
A lot of
it's
funny story. Bill Gates went to Harvard originally to study math, and one of his roommates, he had actually been really good at math in high school, and one of his roommates turned out to be better at Harvard, a guy called Andy Braderman. And that guy scared Gates out of the math major and into the CS major. And people ask, what happened to Andy Braderman? Tax attorney.
And he's a tax attorney.
Yeah.
You know what? I believe it. I think if you take all the people who prepare taxes in the U.S., I think it's the sixth it'd be the sixth largest employer in the U.S.
Yeah, it's insane.
And most of these people, when you think of it, it's such a poor misallocation of resources, right? Most of these people, like you just said, like super smart guy at Harvard. I'm sure he gets paid very well and he does very well, but what a poor use of resources as a society, right? That we got a guy who's a genius, who's doing people's taxes. I mean, that's just stupid.
I kind of knew one of the bubbles had been reached around 2006, 2007, because I was having sushi with a former physics guy who was in finance, a derivatives guy. We're sitting there eating this, whatever, $200 sushi dinner thing. And two little dudes are sitting next to us talking about some derivatives contract, which was being executed purely for tax purposes. And just like, well, this is too much, like too much brain power is going into this right now. So.
Absolutely. So on that front, Hong Kong is still great. Like nobody bothers with these schemes of like, oh, maybe if I finance a movie, I can write this off, etc.
Yeah.
And then you end up producing a terrible movie. There's none of that. So that's good. There's on the labor laws, I still think Hong Kong is terrific. You can hire people easily. You can, fire people. Which is, if the tax code is America's comparative disadvantage, the labor laws are France's comparative disadvantage.
Yes, because you can't fire anybody, right?
You can't fire anybody. Like I think the tax code in the U.S. is like 17,000 pages or something. The labor code in France is like 30,000 pages. You can't do anything. So that in Hong Kong, that's still a paradise for that, no doubt. And then you get into the financial regulation where Hong Kong, like everybody else, has had to tighten meaningfully. But I think that's everywhere around the world.
Yep.
So it's still a good place. It's still a good place overall.
So you've been a keen observer of China and other emerging markets from your perch in Hong Kong. And let's just get into it. So if I follow the Western media today, they tell me China is collapsing. If I turn on Gavical, I learn, wait a minute, their monthly trade surplus is 80 billion. It's on an annualized run rate, it's $1 trillion trade surplus. If I tune into Steve Hsu's podcast, who's interviewing technologists and scientists, I learned that in space, semiconductors, jet engines, electric vehicles, solar panels, they're at parity or beyond parity with the West now in all those areas. So who has the story right?
Well, Steve Hsu definitely has the story right. But let me just say, so one of my favorite philosophers, a Christian philosopher of the 16th century, a guy called Jean Baudin, who would say, the only wealth is man. The only wealth is people. Now, when I studied in China in the early 90s, China was graduating 300,000 university students a year. Today, China graduates last year, it's graduated 11.5 million, and this year it's going to graduate about 12.3 million people. That's a 30x in one generation.
Yep.
In terms of going to your point about, the progress made on semiconductors, the progress made on space, on computers, etc. China now graduates every year more engineers than there are in the United States, than there are engineers in the United States. Now, we could debate all day, yes, but the Chinese universities don't have the same levels as the U.S. universities, and we're comparing apples and oranges, etc. But the point I'd make is 30 years ago, you were graduating 300,000 guys. And even if the 12 million guys you're now graduating are not the same level as your 12 million guys from the University of Michigan or the Harvard that you mentioned or Duke or etc., that's still a whole lot better than plowing fields with behind a horse.
Yeah.
Right. Sorry.
Sorry. I was going to say, I've been a professor for 30 years. And so I've seen the whole arc of what you describe, where at the beginning, if you wanted to get a world-class science education, at least at the graduate level, you had to leave China and come out here. There were no world-class research labs in China. Fast forward to today, there are many Chinese universities with top flight departments across the board in STEM subjects. And about twice the fraction of kids of that 11 million that you described, the percentage that are doing STEM is twice as high as in the United States. So overall, you just get this enormous tidal wave of human capital that's feeding into their system. And their K through 12 grads are pretty good. So basically now they can get all the way up to world-class frontier, research level training at their domestic universities, which even 10 years ago, they couldn't do that, but now they can. So all the stuff is compounding. You can just see it in how young the teams are over there that are doing this world-class work, whether it's in jet engines or satellites or computers. So that human capital thing is for real. It's not going to go away for decades.
So on this, I completely agree with you. But if I was the U.S., perhaps one worrying statistic is if you take the very best Chinese universities, your Beida, your Tsinghua, your Fudan, your Nandas, they used to send a lot of university graduates to the U.S. So you do the undergrads there, and then to your point, you'd come to Michigan to do a master's or a PhD in physics or chemistry or whatever. Those numbers have been in free fall. Now, initially, you thought, okay, it's COVID. Like nobody's moving. It's hard to get out of the country, etc. But even post-COVID, there's been no rebound. Now you could say, well, it's the economic difficulties in China, or it's actually I can now do a very good PhD in chemistry at Tsinghua, which I think is actually what it is. I don't need to spend all this money to go to go. If I'm a top guy, I don't need to spend all this money to go to Michigan. I can go to Tsinghua.
Louis, you went through the pain of having to learn Mandarin, right? So imagine how painful it would have been for you at 22 to say, oh my God, the only place I can do my PhD in material science is at Tsinghua, and now I got to be fully fluent. I got to read all my textbooks in Mandarin. I got to network with my job recruiter in Mandarin. I got to do everything in Mandarin. There are plenty of people in China that are great scientists, but their English isn't that great. So why would they come here, right? It's such a burden for them to come here that they can, if there is an ecosystem for them to develop their skills and to practice what they learned in school in China, they're obviously going to favor that once the system is mature.
So so I think, to your point, I think we've reached that point in China now, and I think that's a change that we perhaps underestimate. We in the Western world underestimate because we just take it for granted that we have the best universities in the world, and that of course, if you're smart, you want to go to Harvard, and of course, once you're in Harvard, you're never going to move back to China because why would you?
Yeah.
And that would, because in fairness, that was always the case for 100 years, or for at least the post-World War II environment. That was the case. And I don't know if it still is. I don't know if it's still the case in the past 5-6 years.
I think it's just tipping now. So, and obviously for the bulk of students who aren't necessarily, they don't necessarily have the choice of going to Stanford or Tsinghua, but it's some other good Chinese university and then some other, reasonably good U.S. university. I think they're much more likely to stay in China now than they were even a few years ago.
Yeah. So I think that's, to answer your question, that's the first point I wanted to highlight, because again, I think it's perhaps people aren't aware of it in the Western world. Now, the second point I'd make, on the whole, China's imploding, and is what I find fascinating is in my career. So I'm 50 years old, but in my career, basically every time you've had a real estate bust, you had a big economic implosion. Banks, went belly up, and you had big rises in unemployment and big deflationary busts in your economy. And that was the case for Japan in the early 90s. That was the case, we mentioned it that was the case in Sweden in 92, in Canada in 94. It was the case all across Southeast Asia in 97. Obviously, the U.S. in 2008 is still fresh in a lot of people's mind. Frankly, Southern Europe in 2011, 2012. Real estate has now been consolidating in China for 4 or 5 years, for a number of reasons. Obviously, trees don't grow to the sky, but also the government actively wanted to take down real estate. They took down real estate. Affordability has gone from, being the most expensive in 20 years to the cheapest in 20 years over the past 5 years. Partly because mortgage rates have halved, partly because real estate prices have gone down about 20-30%. And at the same time, over that same 5-year period, incomes have come up 20-30%. So, you do your affordability ratio, all of a sudden it looks much better. And so China has managed to do a real estate consolidation, which has, hurt growth, which has, killed the sort of like raw feeling the Chinese economy had. But the Chinese economy has not imploded. The show's kept on the road. You haven't had armies of unemployed showing up in cities looking for work. Nobody's gone hungry. You haven't had a fentanyl crisis. It's like the economy has been adjusting for the past 4 or 5 years to a different economy, in fairness. But I think we have the knee-jerk reaction in the Western world of, there's been a real estate bubble. The real estate bubble is imploding. Therefore, it's all going to go to pot. Therefore, everything's going to implode, because that's what happened to us. So how could it not happen to them? Right? I mean, we're just projecting our own experiences onto China.
So could we talk a little bit about the structural differences here? So I think I've heard you mention that roughly speaking, the kind of bad debt overhang is on the order of $2 trillion. Is that fair?
Yep.
And they're working that through the system. Would love to hear your opinion about, whether they still have a lot to work through or they're kind of getting near the end of it. But because for various reasons, like people tend to have a huge amount of equity in the property that they own in China. The banks are basically under state control, right? So the regulators can let them work their way through the debt problem over a number of years. They spread it out over 5 or 6 years. I think, are those the main reasons why the way it worked itself out in China are different from the United States?
Yeah. So, on the one hand, you think $2 trillion, that sounds like a lot of money, which it is. On the other, it's 6% of outstanding bank loans. So to your point, then it becomes, how do the regulators want to treat these bad loans? Can we sweep them under the rug, work them out over the next 5, 6 years, 10 years, which is, by the way, what China's done cycle after cycle. They did this with the SOE consolidation of the 90s. They did this with a lot of the manufacturing debt of 2007, 2008. Now the numbers keep getting bigger, so they can't do this forever. But at 6% of bank loans, they can still sort of extend and pretend for all intents and purposes. Now, this doesn't mean that you should run out and buy Chinese real estate. The sector is consolidating. And the whole business model of the property developers is being torn to pieces, because the whole business model of property developers was always, get money up front. You buy a plot of land, you get a nice office in town, you put up some nice, plans. People put a deposit, and with that deposit, you leverage the deposit and you borrow to build the building. Today, because so many property developers have gone bust, nobody wants to put the deposit down. And because nobody puts the deposit down, the model doesn't work. And so it's funny because in 2008 in the US, in essence, you had a run on the banks. A lot of people didn't feel comfortable lending to banks anymore, especially the banks didn't feel comfortable lending to each other. In China, it's a run on the property developers. Nobody wants to keep their money at a property developer. And I think that, the government could come in anytime and stop this by creating a sort of FDIC of property developers, saying, once you put your money with the developer, there's a government guarantee and the developer has to pay an insurance company. Just like in the 1930s in the US, you created the FDIC to deal with all the bank runs. The government could do that, but doesn't, because I think deep down it wants the consolidation in real estate. Deep down, the government, they wanted this outcome. They never liked the property developers. They always thought they were sort of pariahs and, Donald Trump-like characters.
Well, I would say that, a lot of the property development activity, although it made certain people rich, it wasn't necessarily developing the technological or industrial capability of the country very much. And secondly, it led to all kinds of problems with local governments raising money by just selling off property. And that sort of caused all kinds of, local problems, less control from the center. And I guess now that some of those local governments are in financial trouble right now. So,
well, it's, and I think that's really, to your point, that's really why the government ended up cracking down on real estate. If you go back a few years, there were just too many local governments saying, the Chinese saying is the mountain is tall and the emperor is far away. And there were too many local guys ruling their fiefdom, with massive local corruption, of course, because, the easiest way to get rich in China for the longest time was to convince a mayor to repurpose some agricultural land or common land into private property developer land and sell that to your private property developer buddy who, would then give you a fat envelope. So it was really at the source of much corruption. And the corruption in China did end up being a real problem. Post the big stimulus of 2008, there was simply too many mayors' sons wrapping their Ferraris around trees at 2 a.m. But there were literally a number of these events, and it does look really bad for the party. And the anti-corruption. I think a lot of people in the Western world envisage China, as this dictator where you have this sort of remote ruling class that follows policies that are sometimes hard to explain. And that ends up being very self-serving, etc. In a sense, sometimes almost an image that makes it look like North Korea. Now, China is not a democracy, no doubt about it, but it's also not North Korea. And the Chinese leadership actually spends a lot of time doing surveys of what people think and more importantly, what people complain about. And so if people complain about high property prices, they actually tackle that issue. If people complain about corruption, then they will tackle that issue. And so that it's not an unresponsive dictatorship where it's like, oh, I made it to the top, Now I'm just going to get fed. I'm going to get fed grapes and go hang out on a yacht in Saint-Tropez. It's not exactly like that. And so anyway, they did tackle the real estate developers. They're still tackling them. Frankly, they're not helping them out. So this has had an impact on growth, no doubt about it. But again, the Chinese economy is not imploded.
Yeah. So would you say they're toward the end of this real estate, solving this real estate problem, or are they still right at the beginning? How many more years of this do you think we're going to have?
I think China's in a transition phase, and look, Xi Jinping's been very vocal about wanting to obviously push technology really hard. We talked about all this, the kids moving into STEM, etc. About how wealth creation has to come from beefing up tech, beefing up industry, beefing up manufacturing, beefing up China's exports. And in the past 5 years, China's done remarkably well in that space, actually. When you think of it, China's had to endure a couple things. Well, it's had to endure a real estate bust. It's had to endure a yen at 150. Japan is one of the biggest industrial powerhouses in the world.
Yep.
And it's got a currency that is just stupidly undervalued. I was in Japan a few months ago. It used to be that if you wanted to go out for dinner in Tokyo, you had to get a second mortgage on your house. It was like so expensive. Now Tokyo is the cheapest.
Yeah, it's like a developing country.
It's the cheap. I mean, you go for lunch in Tokyo, like a really nice lunch, it's going to cost you $15.
I think quality adjusted, the eating out, dining out in say Tokyo or anywhere in Japan is like got to be the best deal in the world right now, because you have the highest quality levels,
doubt about it.
And the prices are way down because of the yen. At least if you're an American, it's
no doubt about it.
Yeah.
No doubt about it. No doubt about it. Look, in New York today for $20, you don't get a sandwich. I mean, you don't.
Yeah.
And you get like a really good meal in Tokyo, which is sort of, for anybody who spent time in Asia, is mind blowing, because it always used to be like Tokyo. Oh,
right.
Shoot, I'm going to go there, and everything's going to be so expensive.
To your point, I think you wanted to say that the manufacturers and high tech companies in China are competing against a very weak yen, yet they're taking market share, have huge trade surpluses. And so it's obviously
exactly
for anybody else to try to compete with Japan is extremely hard. And the fact that they can do it tells you something, right?
Exactly. So when you think of it, they've had to deal with a super cheap yen, the real estate bust we mentioned, and on top of that, the American
war
restrictions on war. For any but semiconductor restrictions and whatever else. And with that, from nowhere 5 years ago, China's become the biggest car exporter in the world. Like, if you had told me the yen would be at 150, I would say every car in the world is going to be produced in Japan.
Yep.
But we're moving into a world where every car in the world is going to be produced in China.
Yep.
Because not only are they good at producing cheap internal combustion engine cars, but they've basically, at this point, they've cornered the electric car market. And Europe is waking up to this, because Europe was saying, by 2030, we want every new car sold to be electric. And they're realizing, hold on, if we do that, that means that we want every new car sold to be Chinese. Which creates issues. But beyond electric cars, you got railways, you got power plants, turbines. I mean, you name it. 5 years ago, you mentioned that China's trade surplus has gone from 25 billion a month to 75 or 80 billion a month. And again, that's not because you and I decided to buy 3 times as many pairs of socks or 3 times as many, plastic toys.
Yep.
In the past 5 years, China started exporting a bunch of stuff they never exported before. Right now, China's in negotiations with Saudi Arabia to sell Saudi Arabia nuclear power plants. Now, as a Frenchman, I look at this and I wonder, what the hell just happened here? Like, selling nuclear power plants is our business. That's what we do in France. That's like one of our key comparative advantages. And China comes in and undercuts us by 2/3. They come in at 2/3 of our price. So undercut us by 1/3. It's mind blowing. Building cars, building nuclear power plants, building railroads, that's complicated stuff.
Yep.
Right? I mean, it's not plastic toys anymore.
You know, when I talk to Americans, a lot of the most anti-China people, they want to say, okay, this is all stolen. You guys stole all this IP and technology. And I'm sure some of that happened. But even if you stole stuff without a very powerful human capital and tech infrastructure basis, you're not going to be able to compete across all these different industries going forward. If all they did was steal and you stop them from stealing, you're going to get back ahead of them. But it looks the other way. It looks like they're getting ahead of us now. So very different from how it's perceived here.
All right. So I hate the stealing of IP argument, to be honest. That's sort of one of my bugbears. I always say, okay, look, China's become the biggest EV producer in the world. Like, what did they steal? From whom?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Tesla buys their batteries from them, right? So.
Yeah. Tesla buys their. It's like, who did they steal and from whom to do this? Now you could say they stole it from Tesla, but actually, Tesla early on in its life said, "I'm putting everything up there on the web, everything we've done, and anybody can look at it because we want the world to move to an electric car format." Who did they steal to do this? Nuclear power plant, they build their own nuclear program from scratch. Like this is, it's really hard to steal nuclear stuff because of all the national security around it, et cetera. So like if we want to say China stole the nuclear secrets, then that means that we've got some serious espionage leaks going on in our own countries.
To be honest, when I talk to people like that, I don't even want to fight that battle. I'll just say, look, let's suppose they stole everything, but they have very competent people making use of what they stole. And going forward, just crying about it is not going to solve your problem because they're innovating new stuff, as with EVs, as you pointed out, right? So, or LiDAR or something. Yeah.
And it goes back to what we were saying a little while ago. It's like, look, if China produces more engineers every year than there are engineers in the US, how can we not expect to eventually be bypassed?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it's to say, oh, they're just stealing stuff. It's like, so what are all these people doing? Like, these literally millions of engineers that are getting churned out every year.
Yeah. If you're a technologist, like a Silicon Valley guy or an academic scientist, and you've just been over there and you've interacted with people, you realize that they're sharp. You realize they're comparable. The graduates from their schools are comparable to or better than the graduates from Western schools. So you pretty quickly realize.
In fairness,
yeah,
the graduates. So I've got a young niece who's currently doing a PhD in biomedical engineering at Imperial College in London. She's really bright. She's the hope of our family, etc. We all believe she's going to cure cancer. She's terrific, but half of the people doing Imperial are Chinese. Half of the people at Imperial College, which is like a STEM-based school in the U.S., are Chinese, and the half that's not Chinese is Indian.
Yep.
By the way, when we count, all the STEM people, like China produces more than there are in the U.S., etc. We also have to count that the ones being produced in the U.S., a lot of them are going to go back to China anyway.
Yep.
We have undervalued STEM in our schooling system, not at the university level, but from a much earlier age.
Absolutely.
So that when kids come in at university, most don't even look at STEM.
Yep.
They just blow right past. The only thing kids still look at is computer sciences.
Yep. Exactly.
But how many of our kids still do chemistry or physics or you mentioned material sciences or all these things? Nobody does.
Don't get me started on this because most U.S. universities actually they used to have an Algebra 2 requirement. So this is like high school level algebra that you had to have mastery of that to get your bachelor's degree, and they dropped that because so few students or so many students on campus were having trouble passing that kind of remedial math class. They just waived the requirement now. So it is really a problem here in the United States. This would not be the case at Duke, but at many public universities, it really is an issue. It's an impediment to graduation to require them to have some basic knowledge of math and science. So,
but remember, they steal our secrets.
Yeah, exactly. So
we can't pass maths, but they come and steal our secrets.
So let me ask you something that's been puzzling me for a long time. So when you compare the size of the PRC economy and the US economy, there are two commonly used ways of doing it. One is PPP adjusted. The other one is nominal based on exchange rates. But I've always thought that even the nominal so the PPP thing, let's not get into that right now, but the nominal thing, I've always understood that the way the Chinese government reports what it categorizes toward the nominal GDP number is qualitatively different from the way the US does it. So in other words, services provided by the state, which people don't pay for, are not included in that number, even though it is a form of economic activity for the country. Maybe you could just comment on how you think about the relative size of the two economies.
So, we could go down this rabbit hole, and that'd be a 3-hour conversation. There's so many branches we can go down, but to try to narrow it down, let's stick to nominal GDP. Forget the purchasing parity adjustment, because that opens up different cans of worms as well. Stick to nominal GDP. If we stick to nominal GDP, the U.S. economy is still about a third bigger than the Chinese economy. Now here's where it gets interesting. Is, if you think of the GDP as having, primaries or agriculture and mining, manufacturing industry, etc. So secondary sector, and then your tertiary sector being your services industry. So if you break it down this way, even though the Chinese economy is a third smaller than the U.S., industry, your secondary sector, is 60% bigger than than the U.S. So Chinese today, manufacturing and industry in China is 60% bigger than the U.S. already, and that gap is growing for all the reasons we highlighted: the STEM kids, the fact that industry is an ecosystem. I mean, you're from Michigan. I don't need to tell you this, right? You've got one factory, and it's here because it's next to the other factory that does this, which is next to the other factory that does that, and they all feed into each other. And like once you manage to get that ecosystem going, it can grow quite fast, and it grows on itself. And if you don't have that ecosystem, now the other thing about manufacturing, of course, is you need the engineers, you need the STEM kids, and you need the workers who are trained to be workers in an industry that trains the next set of workers, right? Like the 40-year-old trains the 20-year-old who comes in and who passes on skill. And to some extent, this is what the U.S. has lost, right? In the deindustrialization, so that's not that easy to replicate. You see this with TSMC. The U.S. is giving huge subsidies to TSMC to move their fabs to the US, and TSMC keeps saying we can't find the workers.
Yeah,
like we literally can't find the guys who
my wife's family's from Taiwan. My wife's family's from Taiwan, so I hear all the inside stuff about how frustrated these Taiwanese companies are trying to get American workers to perform the way that people are used to performing, in Taiwan.
Well, Foxconn's another example, right? I remember when Trump got elected, Foxconn said, "Oh, we're going to open a big plant in Wisconsin. We're going to open one in Indiana." 5 years later, there's nada.
Right. So I think I think
they couldn't get the workers.
I think you're emphasizing that as far as manufacturing and doing physical things, the Chinese economy is really qualitatively like almost 2x in some sense larger than the US. But what
I was going to come to that point. So now you come to the services.
Yeah.
You come to the services industry, and the Chinese economy is like 20% of the U.S. economy. So the service industry in China is, when you look through the GDP numbers. Now, you could say the service industry in the U.S. is disproportionately big because, it's as a European coming to the U.S., it's always dumbfounding how great the U.S. is at commercializing things. You go to an American football game where you're mentioning sports. You can't turn around without being offered something to buy, without being made to spend money in a way that doesn't happen in a European stadium. So the service industry in the U.S. is so great at at pushing things on the consumer, etc. It's the financial industry is obviously a really big part of GDP. The healthcare industry is a really big part of GDP. all of which we don't really have in China. So the service industry in China. So on the one hand, you could say, oh, the U.S. service industry is too big, but it seems to work for the U.S. So who's to say that it's too big?
Can I ask you about that though? Because it seems like in terms of consumer purchasing, the efficiency of, if I want to buy something and get it delivered to my house, or I want to shop efficiently and find the right air conditioner for my apartment that fits my window, it doesn't seem like the consumer has any less efficiency or range of choice in China than in the US. So
no, that part is good.
Yeah.
No, that part is good in China. You can, you go on Taobao, you find anything you want, it gets delivered. The e-commerce, in fact, China is the one country outside of the US that has built a proper internet/tech ecosystem.
Right.
It's really, you would think India would have it, given that they have so many engineers.
Right.
But the back-end infrastructure in India isn't that great, right? The roads, the logistics, etc.
So to account for this fact that I think you said that if you just look at the service sector, it's China's service sector by this kind of standard,
it's minuscule.
20% of the U.S. Yet it seems like any kind of transaction that I actually want to involve myself in China, whether it's trading stock or buying an air conditioner or a car, it seems like it's just as developed and just as efficient as what we have in the U.S. So what is that 5-to-1 ratio there that you're talking about?
So I think first it's a poorer country. And I don't know if you're familiar, I could send you pieces on this. There was a French economist called Aftalion who talked about the acceleration phenomena. And the idea is income is distributed along a bell-shaped curve, right? Typically in a country. So, if in China the average income is $10,000, almost everybody makes between 5 and 15. You'll have a small tail of people who make less than 5 and a small tail of people who make more than 15. Now, the reason this matters is there's thresholds for consumption. Mm-hmm. So at $2,000, everybody buys a smartphone. At $1,000, everybody buys a TV. $2,000, everybody buys a smartphone. $10,000, they buy a car. And the more, everything below 15 is all about goods. Everything post 15 is all about services. Once you start making more than $15,000, you spend more money on education. You spend more money on healthcare. You spend more money on financial services. You start buying mutual funds or open a brokerage account. Now, again, so you think of your bell-shaped curve. What's happening in China today is that everybody is in that consumption still bucket of things. So to your point, I make a little more money, I'm going to buy an air conditioner. I make a little more money, I'm going to buy a microwave, or I'm going to buy a car. And by the way, that curve, this is why it's the acceleration phenomena. As it moves to the right, as incomes grow over time, the area that, China was a great example for this. In 2000, China was selling roughly 2 million cars a year. By 2007, it was selling 18 million cars a year because the curve had shifted where the area of people earning $10,000. So all of a sudden, it doesn't, if the curve shifts 20% to the right, your demand for cars doesn't go up 20%. It goes up 7x. So, a lot of the services the Americans spend money on, again, healthcare, finance, education, which, by the way, are really big bills in the U.S. I don't need to tell you the cost of a U.S. education,
yes,
nor the cost of U.S. healthcare. Things that in China are essentially free. Now, you could say they're not free for everybody. The government has to pay some of it, etc. But to your point, that doesn't really get reflected really well in the national statistics.
So that
万事不求人，私人助理、私人顾问时代来临了。六度万事，万事相助，超强博士群不断奉献专项服务，信息、财经、健康、文娱、教育、旅游、消费、科技、美食，让您的生活品质全线升级。六度世界，现在体验，请去3w.6度.world。
限时免费期间，全体注册网友免费使用付费版的高级功能如下：支持论坛搜索，免费画图。第一步，点击右上角最左边的机器人符号开始对话，像图片中红框中的那样。第二步，如图选择六度万事，我们未来将推出更多的 AI 供大家选择。然后就可以与六博士悄悄畅谈了。还支持论坛内部信息搜索哦。 您还可以让六博士做你的助手，帮你绘制漂亮图片。最后，可以点击添加好友进来，一起与六博士工作。一起来 3w.6度.world 尝试吧。